So I should probably get started because I think we're over time. My name is Heather Miller. I'm the Executive Director of the Scala Center at EPFL. I'm also a professor at Northeastern University in Boston. I could talk about a zillion random things, but I figured probably to stay the most relevant to everybody in this room, not to ramble on about some kind of weird type system that I'm working on that nobody cares about. Instead, I could probably talk about some of the things that I think are important in the world of... Sam, are you here? You're going to yell at me. Sam, I always say open source, but I indiscriminately mean free, libre, free, libre software, open source, whatever. This whole acronym of all of that stuff, when I say open source, I generally mean that. You can also say floss. I mean these things. Don't kill me, okay? But anyway, some trends in this world, and also I wanted to give a quick sort of state of the Scala Center, some of the things that we're doing that you might not be aware of. And this is basically 2 talks in one, and I'm going to make it like really fast. So if you're tired, I'm really sorry, but you're going to have to pay attention. Maybe I'll wake you up. All right, so on the open source side of things, let's start with some trends in open source that I think are pretty interesting, and I think it's just worth being aware of in this day and age. I've given this talk, this little interesting, hey, there are some trends in open source a couple of times now at Scala Exchange in December, earlier this year as well. So, I hope you haven't seen this before. But to get started, let's start with a riddle, okay? What might this have to do with Scala or open source or just something, open source, free, open, whatever software? These things, what does that have to do with a sidewalk? Or maybe perhaps one of these, I don't know, zebra crossing, crosswalk things? Another example is a bridge. Maybe this is more obvious why this has some relationship to open source software. The answer is that these things are all examples of common shared physical infrastructure. Anybody can use these things. We depend on these things to bring our kids to work and to bring our kids to school and to get to work and things like this. I hope we're not bringing your kids to work every day. That would be a little weird. But anyway, my point is that you use these things every day. You're not thinking about them existing. They're just there. They're part of your life. Anybody can use them. Generally what you do is, you pay some kind of tax to your local government and you get a bridge built because you need to get some cars on the other side of this river, right? Well, the same is true for digital infrastructure in some sense. There's a whole lot of digital infrastructure that we depend on every day that we don't really give a lot of thought to. And I'd like to argue that open source software is this sort of shared digital infrastructure. And again, I'm going to put floss everywhere. I don't know if you can see that. But this is, I mean indiscriminately all of these things, free, libre, and open source software all in one. If you see floss or if I say open source, this is what I mean. So like physical infrastructure, anybody can use these things. There are lots of things out there that we all depend on and we don't think about. So many things. I mean, everything from, Python, Scala, your operating system, all of these things are examples of digital infrastructure. So if we go back to the physical infrastructure example, well, what happens when you have a problem with your physical infrastructure, if you have a big hole in your sidewalk or your road? The answer is that, nowadays we have these cool apps where we can report to our government and say, hey, there's a problem. I can't get to my house because there's a giant hole that opened in the sidewalk between me and my house. Can somebody do something about this? And eventually somebody will come around and get to patching this hole, right? So we have this sort of centralized government or something to deal with some of these common sort of shared physical infrastructure problems. But what happens if, in a digital infrastructure world, if this is something that is completely broken, that you depend on every day, you can't just like phone up the Penrith local government and be like, Spark is crashing today and I don't know why. Obviously that's crazy. So there's a big difference in sort of how these things are set up, right? There's no central government. It's fundamentally distributed, and it's very ad hoc compared to how we sort of deal with our physical infrastructure and the problems in our world with physical infrastructure. So this part of the talk is going to be very general about like floss open source software. It's not really focused on Scala at all, so you could not care about Scala, you could be totally new to Scala, but I think this is an important sort of takeaway that you should walk away with, in your mind for all open source software out there. And I got a lot of this information from actually a few small sources. There's a report by a woman named Nadia Egbal called Roads and Bridges, and it's a report about how work gets done in our digital infrastructure, on our digital infrastructure, basically. And this was funded by the Ford Foundation, so it was an a non-for-profit foundation that funded sort of this research. And then there's many other blogs, articles, surveys that I'll cite in line. But anyway, if you'd like to read more about these things, this Roads and Bridges report is really worth reading. So the first thing I'd like to just state is that everybody is sort of jumping on this open source bandwagon, and I don't think that's contentious. There are these surveys that are done every year by a company called Black Duck Software. I've never actually heard of it until I saw these surveys. Apparently they're well known. And they survey every year around, I'm not sure they haven't done the 2017 one yet, but every year they survey around 1,200, 1,300 companies. And there's been something that's kind of changed in a big way in the last 5, 6, 7 years. Basically, in 2010, this survey company went out to a bunch of companies and asked a bunch of random questions. And what they found was in 2010, something like 38% of all of the companies that they surveyed said that they depend on open source software, whereas in 2015 that number jumped to 78%, which was a pretty ridiculous difference if you think about it. So here we're still talking about 1,200 companies, so a 2x increase in the number of companies who suddenly started shifting to using open source software. They also asked, well, why would you do this? Why would you use open source software? And actually, I mean, the reasons surprised me, to be honest with you. We like to complain a lot about open source software, things that are like half-baked or incomplete or whatever. And it turns out that the quality of solutions was the #1 reason that people chose to go with open source software. So the next time you check out like some library that's kind of incomplete or something, people seem to think that this is a better solution than building something in-house, leaving it for 10 years, and then finding it again and realizing that we're depending on this random thing that nobody's looked at in 10 years. At least the open source thing, somebody maybe evolves over time. The other two are that the open source solutions have a tendency to be competitive in terms of whatever. I mean, maybe it's performance or the features that they provide or whatever. They offer more things than the proprietary choices in general. And actually, the third in line, which I thought would be the first in line, is the ability to customize and fix these things. Which I thought, well, that's the main reason that you should be wanting to use open source software, because then you don't have to wait 6 years in a queue waiting for your bug to be fixed. You can just fix it yourself, right? Actually not. Yeah, and so nowadays, in 2015, another question that they asked was, well, would you consider going for an open source alternative first or a proprietary piece of software first? 66% of companies wouldn't even look at the proprietary alternative. They just go first for the open source, which is super cool, I guess. But the point is that this has become the default choice. Open source first if you can. And everybody is sort of on this open source bandwagon. And it's not just like this, wonky survey company. There's a bunch of venture capitalists and other sort of startup founders out there that heavily recommend this route. So Mark Suster, an entrepreneur and venture capitalist now, in 2011, I'm just going to read these quotes out to you. He built a company in the 90s, and he said that when he first built his company in 1999, it actually cost him $2.5 million in infrastructure just to get started, and then another $2.5 million in team costs to code, launch, market, and sell their software. But then open source became a movement, a mentality. Suddenly infrastructure was free, and then instead of paying that $2.5 million, they paid only 10% of that price, for maybe support contracts or something else. So he says, well, 90% disruption in cost will spawn innovation, believe me. So he was encouraging people to use open source software and building something that they are going to try and sell to a venture capitalist somewhere. Another one that you might be aware of, Mike Krieger, the co-founder of Instagram, has written a bunch of blog articles about this particular one that I linked to here. I'm not really sure you can actually see this because my font colors are horrible, sorry. But basically in this article he says he suggests strongly to borrow instead of building whenever possible, and there are just much better open source choices out there than anything that you might want to build in-house. So he says there are hundreds of fantastic open source projects that have been built through the hard experience of creating and scaling companies, especially around infrastructure and monitoring, that can save you time and let you focus on actually building out your product. So I mean, this is just another anecdotal piece of evidence that people are generally recommending this. Hey, just go for the open source thing first. And I'm not sure about how serious this is, or like scientifically valid this is, but Nadia made a blog article. The girl who wrote this Roads and Bridges report, she wrote a blog article, and in this blog article, she tries to extrapolate sort of the $1 billion valuation of Instagram, how much of it could have been due to depending on open source. And basically she argues that 143 million of their $1 billion acquisition is due to open source software. You can read this article and then totally disagree with her if you want. Point is, a lot of people thought it made sense. And so the point here is, hey, this is creating value, but nothing is going back into it. That's weird, right? Meanwhile, you have all these companies jumping onto it. You have everybody saying, hey, you should use open source to build your new company, whatever. You don't exactly have like, an asymptote in the number of people contributing to the software, right? This is saying the same or even less. We all know Heartbleed happened, but what's maybe more scary is sort of the human story underneath it, right? So in 2014, 66% of all web servers were using OpenSSL, and then we know that Heartbleed happened that year, right? But meanwhile, OpenSSL was only maintained by a handful of people, and there was this one guy, Steve Marcus, who noticed that there was one guy named Stephen Henson who was working full-time in OpenSSL. And I guess Steve Marcus was doing something else. He was like a government contractor or something. He asked Stephen Marcus why, what did he do? How did he make money? And Stephen Marcus said that he basically did contracting here and there around OpenSSL, and he found out that the Stephen Henson character made only a fifth of what Stephen Marcus made, and Steve Marcus was completely shocked because he thought he was a strong programmer, but nothing next to Stephen Henson. Stephen Henson was much better in his mind than he was, so it was shocking to him that he was making only a fifth of what he was earning as a contractor elsewhere. So the point here is that it seems that Stephen Henson was working on these things, or working on OpenSSL, just trying to scrape by in order to keep focusing on OpenSSL. Meanwhile, the whole world is beginning to depend on it. Nobody has any idea that the one guy who's working on it is basically almost in poverty. Steve Marcus says, I had always assumed, as had the rest of the world, that the OpenSSL team was large, active, and well-resourced. But in reality, OpenSSL wasn't even able to support a single person's work because he had such a sort of low income for the work that he did. Yet everybody, industry, government, the whole planet, is totally unaware of this. They're just jumping more on it, right? And then Heartbleed happened, and suddenly OpenSSL got a ton of money donated because of this, major vulnerability. But I mean, there's many more pieces of open source software that are just as dependent on that we don't know have these problems. And this is also interesting. So I know a lot of people have probably heard of the truck factor, right? Yeah, so the truck factor is, the minimal number of developers that have to be hit by a truck or otherwise quit before a project just dies because, the knowledge and expertise goes away. There was a research group in Brazil that looked at the top 133 most active projects on GitHub, and then they came up with a little bit of math to look at the commits activity and the contributors in the repo, and then to determine the amount of information that's concentrated in individual team members' commits and things like this. And what they found was in these top 133 most active projects on GitHub, around two-thirds of them relied on only one or two developers to survive. The rest had higher truck factors, but most of them, two-thirds of them, had a truck factor of 1 or 2, which is pretty horrifying. And this screen is not amazing, but this is actually the results. And I can't jump around and show you. Usually I can like leap around, but I'm tethered to this thing. But just to list some of some examples. So I can't point, can I? So you've got RX Java, truck factor 1. There is, there's Logstash from Elasticsearch, Clojure, truck factor 2. If you use Jade, that's truck factor 2. Netty, truck factor 2. Python Pandas, truck factor 2. I don't know, there's just a bunch of things in here. Oh, there's like Less and Sass, truck factor 1 or 2. Drupal, truck factor 2. I don't know, there's many more in here. Bundler is truck factor 3, guys. Homebrew, though, is truck factor 250, so that's good. But the point here is that you look at the top 133 projects, and most of them really it's just one or two people who can keep these projects alive. The rest are generally smaller contributions. And if all of these people who are keeping these things alive are Stephen Henson's, well, this would be bad for all of us, right? I have a few more quotes before well, I've several more quotes actually, so settle down, settle in. So there's a longtime Python developer named Noah Kantrowitz, and so this is on the topic of contributor fatigue and all these things. So I really found his description to be very accurate. So this is unaware of any of these numbers that I just rattled off. He says in the early days of open source, there was relatively few projects, and in general, most people that were using a project were also contributing back in some way. So, it was the commons and everybody was contributing back to it, right? But both of these have changed by likely uncountable orders of magnitude, and he's right? Many more users, same number of contributors. As we've moved to, the other problem is the growing imbalance between producers and consumers. In the past, they were roughly in balance. Everyone put time and effort into the commons, and then everyone reaped the benefits. But these days, very few people put in that effort, and the vast majority simply benefit from those who do. This imbalance has become so ingrained that for a company to repay in either time or money, even a small fraction of the value they derive from the commons is almost unthinkable. I'd say that's almost true for a lot of companies. So this is another contributor. This one quit. So he writes documentation for Ruby on Rails, and in November 2015 he exploded and quit from all open source because he was receiving a lot of unsolicited requests for him to do things for free, of course. He writes, "I do not have the time or energy to invest in open source anymore. I'm not being paid at all to do any of the open source work that I do, and so the work that I do is time that I could be spending doing life stuff or writing. It's not fair to expect me to do even more work outside of my regular work and then not get fairly compensated, time or money for it. It's also a great recipe for burnout and making me generally grumpy." This is a very PG example of contributor burnout, but there are many more, much more angry and famous ones. I let you Google for those, but this is a thing that's going on as much as it was before, or perhaps even more, because what we have is also a shift in sort of the expectations of users of software now. A lot of people coming from companies that are used to this proprietary thing and some issue tracker, they have this buyer's always right attitude, and they're yelling at other people in the issue trackers, right? Which is a great way to piss off an open source maintainer. Like, I'm not spending my weekend on this anymore. So there's this weird, I don't know, I can't quantify it, but there's this weird growing anger that I've been sensing for a few years now. So, okay, everybody's going floss crazy, and even the government is doing it in the US, and they've been doing it for a really long time. In fact, at least since around 2000, the Department of Defense has been a major user of open source software, even being used in mission critical situations. And so basically, this was all discovered in a report that wanted to try and determine whether or not it was good or bad that the Department of Defense was using open source software, and if it was good, maybe it would be a way to save money, right? And it turns out that this report was just very, very heavily advocating for continuing to use open source software to promote broader and more effective use of open software in the Department of Defense. And they observe that open source applications tend to be much lower in cost than their proprietary equivalents, and yet they provide high levels of functionality with very good user acceptance. So basically, the Department of Defense back in 2003 was like, oh, more open source, more, right? And well, that's horrifying because, I don't know, are missiles being operated on something that some really stressed out guy is working on and then quitting on the weekends? I don't know, that would be horrible. Yeah, I know, but like, come on, it's scary. So in any case, I mean, the general point or the general trend, which I wish to just kind of point out to you, is that using open source software over a proprietary solution is now rather mainstream, and everybody, startups, enterprise, governments, everybody is jumping on this digital infrastructure, yet we have orders of magnitude more users, yet the same or fewer contributors. It's almost like this rather hollowed out foundation that more and more people are jumping on, right? And I think that a lot of companies and in general people who depend on and use the software are completely unaware of this shifting sort of demographic. I don't know how to reverse this. I have no idea. I merely point out that this is an issue and we should think about it, everybody. In my opinion, I think that if you're a company that uses a lot of open source software, if you have a bug or something, spend a day or a half a day fixing it, and make a pull request back, and consider that like your debt being paid back to society. I think that this should be encouraged in more even startups. I know that nobody has the money or the time for this, of course, but I honestly believe that we should be trying to place this into part of our sort of like expectations for work that we do. Obviously, I'm one person, I probably can't change the world, but this is my viewpoint. I'm happy to discuss how this could be fixed. I just think that these things are not widely known. That's actually all I wanted to say on the, hey, I think there are some weird issues in open source front. The rest, I wanted to actually talk about the Scala Center. So you might ask, well, what does the Scala or the Scala Center have to do with this? I assure you it's not that bad in Scala. Perhaps we don't have as many contributors as we want, but we have a truck factor significantly greater than 2, so it's okay. Actually, so I know this maybe sounds stupid for me to ask, but who doesn't know about the Scala Center? Because somebody recently told me or somebody else that, oh, Scala Center is the thing that's owned by Lightbend, right? Which could not be the case. Like, more emphatically, no, that's not the case at all. It's a not-for-profit center established at EPFL. EPFL is a university in Switzerland. It's not in California. It has nothing to do with California. It's the university that Martin Oderski is a professor at. So we have nothing to do with Lightbend other than Lightbend being on our advisory board. They don't own us or anything like this. And yeah, this is the inspiration for the Scala logo, if you're not aware. This is EPFL. And we have this, as a non-for-profit, we have this mission, which could be concisely described in these 3 points. Independently guide and support the entire Scala community. Coordinate and develop open source libraries and tools for the benefit of the overall Scala community, and to provide deep quality and freely available educational materials for Scala. So this is, again, for the good of all. Like, it doesn't matter if you're like an ultra Java developer, a really awesome functional programmer, whatever we do should be useful to everybody. So it's a not-for-profit center that's equally backed by 8 different companies. So 8 companies take some money, they throw it into a hat, and then basically what we do is we use that money to fund developers to work on issues or projects or initiatives that are for the good of all. So again, it's not like we just do one thing to fix one bug for some company. We don't do that at all. The money is all donations. So these are the companies that support us, and there are many individuals that have also contributed individually to the Scala Center. And without all of these people, like, we would not exist, and we would not be doing anything that, I think these things are useful. I hope you think they're useful too, but we would not be doing any of this without these people and these companies. Of course, always thank you to these folks. So in general, what we try to do, what we would really like to do, one of our main goals is to try and make it easier to contribute not only to just core Scala, but to the Scala ecosystem, to try and also better connect the ecosystem. We want to grow sort of the ecosystem and the contributor base, across everything, not just our core libraries, but the entire ecosystem. We generally think a higher truck factor is a good thing. So with that, I'm just going to actually run through some of the things that we've been working on in the past few months. This is not everything that we've worked on. If you actually want to know more about what we do, we have a website that's actually useful. Maybe the first website that you might have seen when we were announced was not so informative, but now it's much more informative. I can maybe show it real quick, because what we do is we list all of these projects that we're working on, so you can always see all of the things that we're currently doing and kind of what the status of these things are, as well as who's working on these things. So, I mean, even like kind of percentages, right? So here we have Jorge is working on exposing compilation performance, and Martin Duhem is currently working a lot on Dottie. And you can also, we have lots of information, so like more information about each of course the internet's not going to work. Oh yes, oh, cool. We have information about all of the projects, and because we're a nonprofit, we have all of these records available. So, I mean, all of the conditions that these companies agree to before they donate money to us, so if you're ever curious. Also, we have these advisory board meetings every 3 months to talk about the sort of things that everybody thinks is important that maybe should be focused upon. And we take detailed minutes for each of these meetings so you know what we're doing. And also, I have extremely ridiculously detailed documents that are linked to in each of these meetings. This one is 22 pages from last week about concretely all the stuff that we've been up to. So if you're curious and I'm too scant on details in this presentation, either talk to me or you can also dig around this document and have links to exact pull requests that people were making. To get back to this. So yeah, we have a useful website. I hope you believe it's useful too. So what we've been up to in the past few months is really a lot of different things. This is the list of things that we've done in the last 3 to 6 months or so. So one of the most recent projects is trying to provide interactive compilation profiling information. So this is useful for not just tools, but if you have a ridiculous build and something in your build is doing implicit search 48,000 times and it's slowing down compilation, you could maybe find a way to remove that if you don't need it. So it tries to show you where the slow spots are, the things that slow down the compiler. Code migration and linting tools. I'll talk more about that in a minute, but you might have heard of Scala Fix, and that would fit into that category. We're working on the new Scala collections library. Stefan Zeiger, explained a lot about it yesterday. We are also working on that project. We've been working on both SBT and the incremental compiler called Zinc, and we've been a part of the 1.0 release. We also have a few more user-facing projects like Scala in the browser, which includes all the different Scala compilers that are out there, Dotty, Scala Native, type-level Scala, all these things. We also have a package index to help people find libraries. And we've also been working on other things like Scala Native, and then running this Scala platform process, Scala improvement process, things like that. So to just kind of run through some of the things. So this is I hope you can see this. This is a little, not really, right? Okay, so I didn't think the screen would be this bad. So basically, this is the result of this interactive profiling project, and Jorge is also moving too quickly. But when he mouses over things, what happens is you see how many implicit searches are triggered, for example. In this case, like 62, that one method causes 62 to be triggered. And then there's also, it counts the number of macro expansions that something causes. So these are things that you can, hover over and try to figure out what's causing things to slow down. This is the first result of getting this information out. As of a few days ago, we've had this information in a little database thing, and this is the first attempt to show it to people. Of course, there's many other ways that we can show it to you more nicely, but this is the first attempt. Basically, what he's doing is he's collecting statistics per instance of global. If you know macros and all these things, you should know what global is. Basically, what we're trying to do in general is to count things like expansions of macros and the number of times implicit searches are triggered. And he takes all of this information, he puts it, this is all done with a compiler plugin, and it's put into a thing that he calls a profile DB, which is similar to this semantic DB, in that it's a little written to file thing that other tools could use with this profiling information available. And he's done this little prototype where he's integrated it with VS Code. And the idea, right now this is all pull requested to Scala. It's not merged yet, but I can't imagine it will take forever to merge. So this is something that should land, I don't know in which version, hopefully the next version of 2.12. We'll see, maybe it falls into 2.13. The next thing is code migration and linting tools. So do you guys know about Scala Fix? Cool, okay, so I'm beating a dead horse here. Well, cool thing is, you can talk to Olaf about this. This is Olaf's project, but Scala Fix is a tool for rewriting, refactoring, and linting. The initial goal, the reason why this tool was, decided to be a project at the Scala Center was because everybody was like, oh my God, Dotty is coming. How are we going to deal with this? Let's focus on developing a tool that will help automatically upgrade 2.x code bases to Dotty. But Olaf very quickly discovered that Scala Fix could also be used to do automatic refactorings in libraries and things like this. This is an example of refactorings from XOR to either, I think, in Cersei or Cats. I can't remember which one. Cersei? Okay. One of the two Cats. And then, actually, very recently, he released support for basic linting. So here's just a little example of a way that you can implement rules with Scala Meta and Scala Fix as well, and you can kind of create a little linter that reports an error if a case class isn't marked as final, and you get this output here on the bottom. But you can implement your own rules, obviously. you can, I don't want to like talk more about this. You can talk to Olaf if you're curious, or there's a blog article on Scala Lang explaining some of these things. The next thing is this new collections library, which I'm not going to actually say anything more about because Stefan spent 40 minutes talking about it yesterday. So I refer you to Stefan's excellent talk. But this is something that Julien Foy is working on with Stefan at the Scala Center. It's a collaboration between Lightbend and the Scala Center. And there's also several blog articles about it if you want to know what the current status is. Last week, Julien posted a blog article on the Scala Link website about sort of the current status of these things. He's making monthly releases of this Scala collection strawman, so you can even just use it in Scasty or just check it out or whatever, and test out the new collection types if you'd like. We've been doing a lot of things on SBT. SBT is one of these things that's really difficult to just quickly summarize like what we did, but we largely contributed to the push for SBT 1.0 alongside of the Lightbend team. Both Jorge and Martin Duhem, these two guys here, contributed quite a bit of time to it. And Jorge in particular spent a lot of time releasing Zinc 1.0, which is an incremental compiler which tries to, of course, improve these incremental compilation times without sacrificing correctness as much as possible. And he kind of piggybacked on a bunch of work that Grzegorz Kosakowski did a couple of years ago while he was working for Lightbend about class-based dependency analysis to keep things really fast. Actually, I think Grzegorz was claiming like 22x speedups on the incremental compiler with this class-based dependency analysis. I'm not sure if Jorge has done some serious benchmarking yet, but hopefully we get some good speedups on incremental compilation with this. The next thing is Scala in the browser. So we call this thing Scasty. This is something that Guillaume Massé has been working on for a little while now, and it has all of the different Scala compilers that are generally available. It has support for all of these different compilers, plus any library that's published on Maven that we have managed to index. So that means you can use basically any compiler and any library that is compiled for that compiler, in the browser. I don't think I have time to go through this whole video, but just to give you a very brief idea, the idea is that you write something in the browser, and you can fork and save and share these URLs with the code, with the little code snippet that you've compiled and run. You can even log in with GitHub. It doesn't take anything other than your public profile information, and you can sort of save this under your GitHub username, so you can always come back and find your own snippets. And he might show the, I don't know, he might show the I don't know. So yes, he's going to go to build settings. Cool. So you can choose your compiler. You can also choose a library or type in a library there. He didn't do that. But anyway, this is how it works. This is Scasty. He's also added support for autocompletion, which is, I'm on the fence about it. It's really slow in my opinion, but whatever. There's autocompletion now, and there's embedding, an embedded mode now that's available that he's working on a blog post and releasing. The next thing that we've been working on is this package index. So what we did is we crawled Maven and got all this information about the different Scala libraries that were published, and we did a decent job at it. So we managed to get quite a decent scrape of sort of the known Scala ecosystem, and we take the information we get out of POMs, we try to match it with what's on GitHub, and we pull information from various sources, and we end up with a lot of information per library in this library index here. And something new that was just recently added by a Google Summer of Code student actually is contributing info. So Michael Viveros here, this fellow here, contributed the ability to, well, basically what he's done is he collects libraries that have both like a contributing MD specified in the GitHub repository, some sort of chat room like Git channel somewhere, and several issues that are tagged with some kind of beginner level tag, so novice or beginner or low-hanging fruit or something like this, and he aggregates those tickets, and so these things show up on the front page. So basically the idea is if a library has these things, which is generally required for it to be sort of contributor friendly, like some tutorial about how to contribute to the library, some way to interact with the developers, and then some tickets that newcomers can get started with, then he puts these on the front page of Scala Dex to hopefully help people find these libraries. So that's a new thing that he just added, which was pretty cool. We also, this is perhaps less interesting, we fixed lots of the websites. All of the websites, they're not completely fixed, there are some broken links here and there, but we have a new scalalang.org. The doc site has been totally redone. And we also have this useful, I hope, website for the Scala Center. But this was joint work with 47 Degrees. They sort of overhauled and made these things all like mobile friendly and other things. So totally new documentation site, which is hopefully a lot less ugly and easier to find stuff. Okay, and maybe to try to wrap up, we've been doing a lot of work on other projects that I don't really have time to go into a lot of detail about, but Scala Native is one of them. And I don't want to like make a lot of noise about it. I think a lot of people might already know, but Dennis and Martin Duhem managed to compile Scala C with Scala Native. They did all kinds of caching hacks to make it quite fast. Exactly the speed up at the moment, I'm not going to say because I've heard many different numbers. I'm not sure what the current one is, but you can always ask Dennis, and he can like dig himself a grave by promising a super ridiculous speed up, which I'm not going to promise. But there have been many other things that we've contributed to Scala Native, including all kinds of libraries, support for all the Java I/O, regular expressions, these things. The Scala improvement process, something that is ongoing. There's not a lot to report about it except that we need to start kicking people in the butt and forcing people to confirm availabilities on live meetings, because basically we've had this plan to go have meetings once a month, and instead they've been like stretched out because nobody shows up for meetings. So other than our need to like chase people with a stick, these are going just slowly at the moment. And the next thing that we're actually going to work on, perhaps if you wake up, is macros. Yeah, so this is actually new news as of a week ago on Tuesday. So we got charged with the responsibility of releasing a production-ready macro library, or not library, it's definitely not a library, macros for 2.13 and Dotty. The idea is that from 2.14 and onwards, it would be non-experimental in Scala C, and that would be a macro framework that would work across both compilers. It would build on the stuff that Eugene Bermanko has done. And this is something that Olaf will be leading. Okay, and that's roughly all I have to say about sort of the things that we've been up to lately. But to reconnect back to the open source stuff that I've been talking about earlier, I don't know if you noticed, but tomorrow there's this open source spree that we're having, which sounds kind of weird. It's a little bit like a hackathon, but the idea is to try and grow the community of people who are involved in some of these open source libraries. It's more of a community building exercise than anything, trying to help people who are like, hey, I've never actually participated in an open source project, I don't know how to get started. I happen to be here. And to match those people with library maintainers that are in person at the conference. And the idea is that we have a list of projects where the maintainers are there. The maintainers have come up with a couple of issues that beginners can work on in a couple of hours. And the goal is for these people, these beginners or these newcomers to these projects, to make a pull request back to one of these libraries by the end of the spree. It's a couple of hours long, and if they do, they get one of these cool Scala contributor t-shirts. I'm not sure you can really see it, but it says contributor on the back, it's the big Scala logo on the front. And really the idea is to get people to meet each other and to also get people used to the process of contributing something and to talk to the person that is responsible for the library that you're trying to contribute to, because we're all actually very friendly human beings. If not always so on the internet, we really are in person, I'm sure. So the idea is to sort of break that ice. And that's tomorrow afternoon, so you should participate in that if you're interested. If you want to know which projects are represented, I should have loaded it up on the laptop, but at the moment it's a bunch of Scala Center things, and it's a bunch of John Pretty's libraries. However, if you're interested in one of your libraries being thrown into the spree, the way that you can get your library on the list is first come up with like 3 issues that somebody could work on in a couple of hours. And second, make a pull request to this README file that we have in the Scala Sprees repo, which is under the Scala Center. Let's see if I can just grab it real quick. Sprees, okay. This should be the repo, can you see it? Scala Center /Sprees. And so this is the information about it. There's, you know, kind of the rules and how it's structured. And these are the things that are on the list for people contributing to. But you're welcome to also, if you are a maintainer of a library here and you'd like to have your library represented in this, just make a pull request to this and show up and be willing to help a newcomer get involved in your library. And if somebody can make a pull request back to your library, we give that person a cool Scala contributor t-shirt, is the idea. Okay. So that's tomorrow. Please don't forget. Do it. Everybody seems to be happy. Okay, so that's it. I'm not going to ramble on any further, but other than reading to you more quotes that I like, so I swear this is it. So there was one more quote from Nadia Eghbal that really resonated with me, and it kind of summarizes very nicely the sort of same idea or thoughts that I arrived at the end of sort of realizing all of these things. She says, in the last 5 years, open source infrastructure has become an essential layer of our social fabric, but much like startups or technology itself, what worked for the first 30 years of open source's history won't work moving forward. In order to maintain our pace of progress, we need to invest back into the tools that help us build bigger and better things. So, you know, the bottom line here is we can't really rely on what we've been doing for the last 30 years, given how things have changed so much in the last 5 years. We have to try and adapt. And with that, that's all I have to say. And like I said, remember, we don't want your money, we want your pull requests. Please get involved in some sort of open source project if you can. But thanks. It's basically like exactly 4:00.00. Anybody have a question? And then we can all escape. Yep. 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 So actually, us, not really. It's never really come up as something that we should really do for Scala because IntelliJ support is so good. Not that, look, I know, but I know. But this is kind of the argumentation floating around, okay? Like, don't shoot me. All right, so we didn't, well, actually, I did know this and I forgot it, but I'll pretend like I just found out that we indirectly supported this. So, but, you know, us at the Scala Center, there's nothing concrete that we're doing. If you think it's really important, what you should do is talk to one of the community representatives, which is either Bill Venners or Lars Huppel, and they can bring this to the Scala Center advisory board thing and be like, okay, guys, IntelliJ isn't the only thing. Maybe we should support, you know, this language server protocol. Somebody should invest some time on it. Everybody will have a discussion, decide if it's a good way to spend developer time, and then maybe we do it. So either talk to Lars or Bill Venners, and maybe it comes up. You'd have to write a little proposal. Okay, anything else? I'm happy to chat offline too, so everybody can just escape and go to, I think it's coffee, right? Thanks.